She was already dead when he realized she'd given him sons. Kang Jae-yoon didn't attend funerals. The Daunt of Seoul, the man who controlled half the city's legitimate wealth and all of its shadowed power, didn't kneel at graves or bow to memory. Death was a business transaction he orchestrated, not a ritual he observed. Yet here he stood on rain-softened earth in broad daylight, his black Brioni suit absorbing the gray morning light, surrounded by headstones that marked the permanently powerless. The funeral for Anita Baker had been private, deliberately small. Her family, what little remained, hadn't known who to contact beyond the lawyer who'd appeared with guardianship papers bearing Jae-yoon's name. The Kang Syndicate's legal team had handled the logistics with surgical precision. Closed casket, expedited burial, minimal witnesses, clean, controlled, exactly the way he preferred his operations. But standing there, staring at the mahogany casket being lowered into Korean soil, Jae-yoon felt something crack beneath his carefully constructed armor. This wasn't an operation. This was Anita, the woman whose laughter had once filled his penthouse before he'd made the calculated decision to erase her from his life. The woman he'd convinced himself would be safer, happier, alive if she existed anywhere but in his world. He'd been wrong. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but moisture still clung to the air, carrying the scent of disturbed earth and funeral lilies. His security detail formed a loose perimeter 50 meters back, close enough to respond, distant enough to grant the illusion of solitude. Han, his head of operations, stood nearest, expression unreadable behind dark glasses, a manila envelope tucked under one arm. The contents of that envelope would reshape everything Jae-yoon thought he understood about the last 3 years. But it was the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision that made his world fracture. 2 small figures stood 20 feet away, flanking a middle-aged woman in modest black. The boys were barely 2 years old, dressed in miniature suits that swallowed their tiny frames, their dark hair catching the weak sunlight. They weren't crying, they weren't moving. They simply existed in that terrible, hollow way toddlers do when the world has shifted beneath them, and they lack the words to name their grief. Jae-yoon's breath seized. The boy on the left had his nose, sharp, even in infancy. The boy on the right had his jawline, already showing the stubborn set that Jae-yoon saw in his own reflection every morning. But it was their eyes, dark, almond-shaped, too solemn for their age, that confirmed what the guardianship papers had claimed and what his rational mind had refused to accept. Jun and Seo, his sons. The twins Anita had carried, birthed, and raised in complete silence, while he'd built his empire on the bones of everything soft he'd once allowed himself to feel. The woman holding their hands noticed his stare. She was Anita's cousin. He vaguely remembered Han mentioning her name. She looked at Jae-yoon with the particular contempt reserved for men who abandon women, and the complicated fear reserved for men who could make people disappear. She bent, whispered something to the boys, and nudged them forward. They toddled toward him with the unsteady gait of children still learning their legs. Their small feet left impressions in the damp grass. When they stopped 3 feet away, wobbling slightly, Jae-yoon realized he'd forgotten how to breathe. June, it had to be June. Slightly bolder, more curious, reached up with both arms in the universal gesture of a child wanting to be held. His small fingers opened and closed, grasping at air, at trust, at the father he'd never known. Seo watched, quieter, his thumb finding his mouth as his eyes tracked Jae-yoon's face with devastating intensity. Jae-yoon had negotiated billion-won deals without flinching. He'd ordered executions with a signature. He'd dismantled rival syndicates before breakfast, but faced with 2 toddlers who carried his DNA and their dead mother's vulnerability, he found himself catastrophically unequipped. He knelt. The damp earth soaked through his custom suit. His hands that had broken men, signed death warrants, built an empire, trembled as he lifted June into his arms. The child was impossibly light, warm, real. Seo pressed against his leg immediately, small body seeking comfort from a stranger who wore their mother's grief in his eyes. They stood there, 3 strangers bound by blood and tragedy, while the cemetery workers finished covering Anita Baker's casket with Seoul's unforgiving earth. Jae-yoon felt the eyes of his security detail. Knew Han was calculating the political ramifications. Understood that somewhere in the city's shadows his enemies were already sharpening their knives, because the Daunt of Seoul, untouchable, immovable, invincible, now had a weakness. 2 of them, small, grieving, and standing in broad daylight for anyone to see. Welcome to Ruthless Romance Tales, and you just walked into the kind of story that doesn't let go. If you've been here before, you know we don't traffic in safe, we deal in dangerous, in addictive, in the kind of love that rewrites your blood and refuses to apologize. And if you're new, strap in, because what you're about to witness is a man who built an empire on ruthlessness, learning that his greatest weakness might be his only salvation. Smash that like button like it owes you money. Subscribe because you're already hooked whether you admit it or not. And hit that notification bell hard, because missing what happens next would be a crime. Now let's watch the Daunt's world burn and rebuild. The penthouse had never held children before. Jae-yoon's sanctuary, all clean lines, obsidian surfaces, and temperature-controlled silence now vibrated with disruption. Jun's wail cut through the air like a blade, high-pitched and relentless. Seo sat in the corner of the leather sectional, silent tears tracking down his brown cheeks. Thumb lodged in his mouth as he stared at nothing. Jae-yoon stood in the center of his living room, hands curled into fists at his sides, utterly paralyzed. The Daunt of Seoul, who commanded armies of enforcers and moved billions with a signature, couldn't stop a 2-year-old from crying. Han had arranged everything with his usual efficiency. A bedroom had been converted, twin beds with railings, soft blankets, toys still in packaging scattered across the floor like evidence of purchased affection. A nanny was scheduled to arrive in the morning, but right now, at 2 a.m, it was just Jae-yoon and the sons who looked at him like he was a stranger wearing their father's face, because he was. Jun's crying escalated. Jae-yoon moved toward him, reached down with hands that suddenly felt too large, too rough, too stained with things children shouldn't touch. He lifted the boy awkwardly, and Jun immediately arched away, small body rigid with rejection. I don't, Jae-yoon's voice came out sharp, wrong. He tried again, softer. I don't know what you need, Jun wailed louder. Seo's silent tears fell faster. Jae-yoon carried Jun to the converted bedroom, Seo trailing behind with the haunted obedience of a child who'd learned that protest changed nothing. He set Jun in one of the beds, and the boy immediately scrambled to the edge. Reaching for his brother, Jae-yoon lifted Seo into the same bed. They curled into each other instantly, Jun's arm wrapping around Seo's smaller frame with protective desperation. The sight split something open in Jae-yoon's chest. He grabbed one of the books the nanny service had delivered, something with bright illustrations and simple words. He sat on the edge of the bed, opened to the first page, and began to read. His voice came out graveled, stilted, designed for boardrooms and interrogations, not bedtime stories about rabbits and friendship. Jun stopped crying, but not because of comfort, because of confusion. Jae-yoon pushed through, page after page, his throat tight with failure. When he finally closed the book, both boys were staring at him with identical expressions of wary exhaustion. Not trust, not love, just the terrible acceptance of children who'd already learned that adults were unreliable. Sleep, Jae-yoon said, the command gentler than he'd ever spoken in this penthouse. He stood to leave, and Jun's small hand shot out, gripping the sleeve of his shirt. The child didn't say anything, just held on. Seo's fingers found Jae-yoon's other hand a moment later. Jae-yoon sat back down, trapped between 2-year-olds who needed something he'd spent a decade teaching himself not to give. He stayed until their breathing evened out, until their grips loosened and sleep finally claimed them. When he extracted himself, his shirt was wrinkled, his chest hollow. Han waited in the hallway, manila envelope in hand. His expression was carefully neutral, but Jae-yoon caught the flicker of something softer beneath the professional mask. The legal documents, Han said quietly, extending the envelope. Anita Baker's will and guardianship designation. Jae-yoon took it, moved to his office, the one room still untouched by the chaos of sudden fatherhood. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey he wouldn't drink and opened the envelope. The will was brief. Anita had almost nothing to leave a savings account with, barely enough to cover her funeral, a few personal items. But the guardianship papers were meticulous, notarized, updated 3 months ago. In the event of my death, I designate Kang Jae-yoon as sole legal guardian of my sons, Kang Jun and Kang So. She'd given them his name. Even after he'd destroyed what they had, even after 3 years of silence, she'd trusted him with the only things that mattered. The knife of regret twisted deeper. The accident, Jae-yoon said, his voice empty. Investigate it. I want to know everything. Han nodded. Already started. Initial reports show brake failure, but the timing. He paused. It's convenient. Find out who benefited from her death. Sir. Han hesitated. There's something else. The boy's belongings. There wasn't much, but Han produced a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper. This was in Jun's jacket pocket. Jae-yoon unwrapped it. A tiny silver charm fell into his palm, a lotus flower, delicate and tarnished with age. His fingers closed around it reflexively, muscle memory firing before his mind could catch up. He'd given this to Anita 3 years ago, their last night together. The memory detonated behind his eyes with the force of a blade between ribs. His old apartment, before the penthouse, before the Daunt title, Anita stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul's glittering sprawl, wearing nothing but his white dress shirt, the hem brushing the tops of her thighs. The city's lights painted her rich brown skin in amber and shadow, turning her into something ethereal and devastating. He'd approached from behind, whiskey in hand, and she'd turned with that smile, the one that made him believe he could be something other than his father's weapon. "You're staring," she'd said, voice warm with knowing. "You're worth staring at." She'd taken the glass from his hand, sipped, her full lips leaving a mark on the rim. The charged silence between them was its own language. He'd traced the curve of her neck with his mouth, tasted the salt of her skin, felt her breath hitch against his lips. Jae-yoon. His name on her tongue was prayer and damnation. He'd turned her to face him, hands framing her face, thumbs brushing the sharp angle of her cheekbones. Her dark eyes held questions he couldn't answer. The silk of her natural curls slipped through his fingers as he kissed her slow, deliberate, memorizing the architecture of her mouth like he was cataloging evidence he'd need later, because he'd already decided. Later, in the tangle of sheets and fading adrenaline, he'd fastened the lotus charm around her wrist. Her skin was warm, damp, her pulse fluttering beneath his fingertips. "For protection," he'd said. She'd laughed softly, the sound vibrating against his chest. "From what?" "From me." Her smile had faltered. She'd seen the truth in his eyes before he'd spoken it. "I'm ending this," he'd said, the words clinical, brutal. "You'll leave Seoul, tonight. My people will set you up anywhere you want. New identity, money, safety, but you don't come back. You don't contact me. You disappear." "Why?" Her voice had cracked, and the sound of it nearly broke his resolve. "Because my father's dead, and the council meets in 6 hours to confirm me as Daunt. If they know about you, they'll use you, hurt you, kill you to test my loyalty." He'd gripped her shoulders, forced her to see the monster he was becoming. "I can't protect you and take the title. So I'm choosing the title." She'd stared at him, tears streaming down her face, cutting paths through the remnants of pleasure and promise. But she'd understood. That was the worst part. She'd understood exactly what he was sacrificing her for. "I love you," she'd whispered. "I know." He'd made her leave before dawn, watched her walk out wearing yesterday's clothes and his charm, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach, a gesture he hadn't understood then but now recognized with devastating clarity. She'd already known. She'd been pregnant, and she'd left anyway, protecting his choice even as it destroyed her. Jae-yoon opened his eyes. The charm bit into his palm where he'd been gripping it hard enough to draw blood. Han had left quietly. The penthouse was silent except for the soft sounds of children sleeping down the hall. He moved on instinct, opening drawers he hadn't touched in years, searching until he found an antique silk scarf, deep burgundy, still folded carefully. He lifted it, and the scent hit him immediately. Cinnamon and sea salt. Anita's signature, faint but unmistakable after 3 years. His hands trembled. She'd left it behind that last night, forgotten in her grief and hurry. He'd kept it. Couldn't bear to throw it away. Couldn't bear to look at it. Now he pressed the silk to his face, breathing in the ghost of her, and felt something crack completely. The fabric was soft against his skin, a texture memory that brought back every touch, every whispered word, every moment he'd convinced himself he could erase by force of will. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty room, to her memory, to the woman who'd loved him enough to disappear. "I'll protect them. I swear it." The words were a vow to the dead, and a promise to the living. He stood there in the darkness of his office, the scarf clutched in one hand and the lotus charm in the other, 2 relics of a love he'd murdered to secure his throne. The weight of them felt heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. Outside, Seoul's shadows shifted, and somewhere in those shadows, the people who'd killed Anita Baker were already calculating their next move. The safe house sat in the mountains north of Seoul, hidden behind gates that could withstand military assault and surveillance systems that tracked every breath within a kilometer radius. Jae-yoon had moved the twins at dawn, watching through tinted windows as Han's team swept the property for the 3rd time in as many hours. The woman waiting inside was not what he'd expected. Gina stood in the main living area, with her hands folded, her posture suggesting neither fear nor deference. She was perhaps 30, with warm brown skin and natural hair pulled into a simple bun. Her clothes were practical dark jeans, a cream sweater, and her eyes held the kind of quiet intelligence that came from observing rather than speaking. "Mr. Kang," she said, her voice steady. "No honorifics, no performance. The twins are in the car," Jae-yoon replied, studying her with the same scrutiny he'd use on a business acquisition. "You understand the terms? Live-in governess. No contact with the outside world, total discretion. Her gaze didn't waver. I understand the terms. I'm less clear on whether you understand what these children need. The challenge landed like a slap. Jae-yoon's jaw tightened. Elaborate. They just lost their mother. They don't need another stranger. She moved to the window, looking out at the car where June and Seo waited. You can pay me whatever you want, Mr. Kang, but money doesn't heal trauma. Presence does. Consistency does. And from what I've been told, you're not exactly known for either. Han shifted behind Jae-yoon, hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Jae-yoon raised a finger, stopping him. You're right, Jae-yoon said quietly. I'm not. Which is why you're here. Something flickered across Gina's face, surprise, maybe, or reassessment. She nodded once. Then let's bring them inside. The first week was chaos. Seo woke screaming every night, and Jae-yoon stood uselessly in the doorway while Gina moved through the darkness with practiced ease, gathering the boy into her arms and humming something low and soothing. June refused to eat, pushing away every meal until Gina sat beside him and made eating a game instead of a command. Jae-yoon watched, learned, failed repeatedly. On the 8th night, Seo's nightmare was worse. His screams tore through the safe house with primal terror. And when Jae-yoon reached the boy's room, Gina was already there, trying to calm the thrashing toddler. Nothing worked. Let me, Jae-yoon said, moving forward. He lifted Seo, held him against his chest the way he'd seen Gina do, but the boy only fought harder. Jae-yoon's hands tightened reflexively, his voice sharpening with frustration. So, stop. You're scaring him, Gina said softly. She placed her hand over Jae-yoon's, loosening his grip. Softer, he doesn't need restraint. He needs safety. Jae-yoon forced his muscles to relax, his hold to gentle. Seo's cries didn't stop, but they quieted slightly. Your power commands compliance, but these boys need trust, Gina said, her hand still resting on his. The contact was innocent, necessary, but Jae-yoon felt it like a brand. You haven't earned it yet. The truth of it settled like a stone in his chest. He was the daunt of soul, capable of moving mountains with a phone call, and he couldn't comfort his own son. Gina took Seo from him carefully, and within minutes, the boy's breathing evened. She laid him back in bed, adjusted the blanket, then turned to find Jae-yoon watching her with an expression she couldn't read. I'll learn, he said. I know, Gina replied, but you have to want to. Not because they're leverage or legacy, because they're children who need a father. Before Jae-yoon could respond, his phone vibrated. Han's name flashed on the screen. He stepped into the hallway, answering with silence. The council sent someone, Han said without preamble. Legal representative. They're invoking Clause 47 guardianship nullification for unmarried daunts with unapproved heirs. Jae-yoon's blood went cold. When? 20 minutes ago. I stalled them at the main gate, but they have paperwork. Official. They want the twins' location, or they'll present this to the full council tomorrow. Tell them, Jae-yoon said, his voice dropping to lethal calm, that if they invoke that clause, I'll burn the council charter and everyone who signed it. The twins stay with me. Non-negotiable. Understood. But sir, this means someone inside leaked. They know about the boys. They know about Anita. Find them. Jae-yoon ended the call and stood in the darkened hallway, his hands curling into fists. The internal threat wasn't theoretical anymore. It was mobilized, weaponized, and aimed directly at his sons. He returned to the doorway of the twins' room. Gina sat between the two beds, her presence a quiet bulwark against their nightmares. She looked up, caught the shift in his expression, the cold rage bleeding through his control. What happened? She asked. Nothing you need to worry about, Jae-yoon said. But he was lying, and they both knew it. She stood, crossed to him, and stopped close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender from her skin. These boys have already lost one parent to secrets and lies. Don't make them lose another. Jae-yoon stared down at her, this woman who had no connection to his world, no reason to care beyond a paycheck, and yet stood between him and his own worst instincts with absolute fearlessness. I won't, he said, and realized with startling clarity that his protective obsession had expanded to include her too, because Gina was the purest soul in his entire blood-soaked empire. And if his enemies discovered that, they'd use her the same way they'd use his sons. He'd burn the world before he let that happen. Han delivered the findings 72 hours later, his expression carved from stone as he laid the folder on Jae-yoon's desk. The safe house office was sparse, functional, a war room disguised as domesticity. Outside the window, June and Seo played in the secured courtyard under Gina's watchful eye. Chairman Che, Han said without preamble. The brake line tampering was professional, his signature work. The surveillance on Anita started 6 months ago. He knew about the twins before we did. Jae-yoon's hands flattened on the desk, knuckles white against dark wood. The rage that had been simmering since the funeral crystallized into something cold and surgical. Proof? Proof. Digital forensics traced the payment through 3 shell corporations, all tied to Che's network. The mechanic who did the work was found dead 2 days after Anita's accident. Convenient cleanup. Han paused. He wanted the twins vulnerable, orphaned, easy targets to leverage against you. He miscalculated. Jae-yoon's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. Find every asset he has, every account, every property, every person he values. I want a complete map by tomorrow. Already done. Han slid a second folder across the desk. Waiting on your order. Jae-yoon didn't open it. Not yet. Because once he did, once he set this machinery in motion, there would be no restraint, no mercy. Chairman Che had killed the mother of his children, and the debt for that would be paid in blood and ruin. But first, he had to make sure his sons survived long enough to see justice delivered. He found Gina in the kitchen that evening, preparing dinner while keeping one eye on the twins through the window. She moved with quiet efficiency, her hands steady as she chopped vegetables. The domesticity of it felt alien in Jae-yoon's world, a glimpse of something normal he'd never allowed himself to want. You're staring again, she said without looking up. You're observant. It's my job. She glanced at him, and something in her expression shifted. You've been on the phone all day. That voice you use, the one that makes grown men afraid, it's very different from the voice you use with June and Seo. Which one do you prefer? Neither. She set down the knife, turned to face him fully. I prefer the one you use when you think no one's listening. The one that sounds almost human. The observation landed with unexpected weight. Jae-yoon had spent a decade perfecting masks, and this woman who'd known him barely 2 weeks was already cataloging the fractures. I fixed Seo's toy, he said, changing the subject. The mechanical dog. It works now. Gina's lips curved slightly. I noticed. He carried it around all afternoon. The praise shouldn't have mattered. It did. The nightmare came at 2 a.m, and this time it was June who woke screaming. Jae-yoon reached the boys' room first, found June thrashing in sheets soaked with sweat, his small face contorted with terror. Gina arrived seconds later, but when she reached for the boy, June fought her with desperate strength. No, mommy. Jae-yoon moved on instinct, gathering June into his arms and holding him tight against his chest. The boy's small body was rigid, heart hammering like a trapped bird. Jae-yoon pressed his face into June's hair, breathing in the clean scent of child shampoo and something indefinably precious. I'm here, he murmured, the words rough. You're safe. I'm here. June's screams dissolved into sobs, his small hands fisting in Jae-yoon's shirt. The sensation of his son's heartbeat against his own chest was overwhelming proof of life, proof of responsibility, proof that love could be weaponized by anyone who knew where to strike. The storm in Jae-yoon's head, the constant calculation, the violence, the cold architecture of survival went silent. In this moment, there was only the weight of his son in his arms, and the desperate need to make the world safe enough for this child to sleep without screaming. Gina stood in the doorway, watching. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her eyes had softened. She was witnessing the truth of him, not the daunt, not the killer, but the father who'd arrived too late and was trying desperately to make up for lost time. June's breathing eventually evened, his grip loosening. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he tilted his head back, looking up at Jae-yoon with red-rimmed eyes that held too much understanding for a 2-year-old. Why did you send Mommy away? The question was small, broken, accusatory. Jae-yoon's throat closed. He could feel Gina's gaze on him, could sense the weight of this moment. He'd built an empire on lies and strategic omissions, but he couldn't lie to this child. I thought I was protecting her from my world, he said, the words scraping out. I thought if she left, she'd be safe. I was wrong. June stared at him, processing. Is that why she's gone? Yes. Are you going to send us away too? The question broke something fundamental in Jae-yoon's chest. He tightened his hold on June, his voice fierce with certainty. Never. You're staying with me, both of you, no matter what. June studied him for a long moment, then pressed his face back into Jae-yoon's chest. Okay. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't trust, but it was acceptance, and for now, that was enough. Jae-yoon sat there long after June fell asleep, his son's weight anchoring him to something that felt dangerously close to redemption. When he finally looked up, Gina was still watching, tears tracking silently down her brown cheeks. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. She'd witnessed the moment the Daunt of Soul chose his children over his armor. And somehow, that made her just as dangerous to him as any enemy with a gun. Because she was starting to see the man beneath the monster. And that man was falling apart. Han arrived at dawn with a single encrypted drive, his expression revealing nothing as he set it on Jae-yoon's desk. But his hands trembled slightly, a tell Jae-yoon had never seen in 15 years of working together. Anita left this with her lawyer, Han said quietly. Instructions to deliver it only if she died and only to you. It's a ledger. 3 years' worth of Chairman Che's money laundering routes, shell corporations, blackmail leverage, and trafficking records. Everything. Jae-yoon stared at the drive. The implications detonated slowly, each one more devastating than the last. She knew he was watching her. Knew he'd eventually move against her to get to you. Han's voice was carefully neutral. She built you a weapon, sir. The kind that doesn't just wound, it erases. Jae-yoon picked up the drive, the weight of it insignificant compared to what it represented. Anita had spent 3 years documenting his enemies' sins while raising their sons alone, protecting them from shadows Jae-yoon hadn't even known existed. She'd given him the means to win a war he'd been too blind to see coming. She'd trusted him, even after he'd destroyed them both. The memory hit without warning, dragging him back 3 years to the moment everything fractured. His apartment, Anita wrapped in his sheets, her brown skin luminous in pre-dawn light, her eyes heavy with the secret she hadn't yet told him. He'd already made his decision, already chosen the throne over her heart, but his body betrayed him one last time. He'd traced the curve of her spine with reverent fingers, memorizing the architecture of her, the way she sighed when he kissed the hollow of her throat, the way her hands gripped his shoulders when he whispered her name like a confession. Stay. She'd breathed against his mouth, the word desperate. I can't. Then take me with you. Into whatever darkness you think you're protecting me from. Let me choose. No. He'd pulled back, forced ice into his voice even as his hands refused to let her go. You don't understand what they'll do to you, what I'll become. I'm choosing your life, Anita, even if it destroys us both. She'd stared at him, tears streaming, one hand pressed to her stomach. And if I'm already carrying part of you? What then? He'd frozen. The question hung between them like a blade. You're not, he'd said, the lie tasting like ash. But he'd known. Somewhere deep in his bones, he'd known. And he'd sent her away anyway, choosing the illusion of her safety over the reality of their love. She'd understood his sacrifice, had loved him enough to disappear, had spent 3 years protecting their sons and building him a weapon for the war she knew was coming. Jae-yoon opened his eyes, the drive still clutched in his fist. The cost of that choice was a grave in Korean soil and 2 orphaned boys who called him a stranger. Compile everything, he said, his voice hollow. Cross-reference it with Che's known associates, his legitimate businesses, his political connections. I want a complete strike package by tonight. Sir, if you use this, there's no going back. The council will see it as a declaration of total war. You'll have to choose between the Daunt title and... I've already chosen. Jae-yoon's gaze was lethal. My sons don't need the Daunt. They need a father who's alive to raise them. Han nodded once and left. Jae-yoon sat alone in the office, the weight of Anita's final gift pressing against his chest like a physical thing. She'd given him everything, her body, her heart, her children, and now her vengeance. All he'd given her in return was abandonment and a grave. The door opened softly. Gina stood in the threshold, her dark eyes unreadable. The boys are asking for you. I'll be there in a moment. She didn't leave. Instead, she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. I overheard your conversation with Han. Not all of it, but enough. Jae-yoon's jaw tightened. You shouldn't have. Probably not. She moved closer, her presence steady and unnervingly calm. You're planning something that puts you at risk. It's necessary. For revenge or for protection? The question was too perceptive. Jae-yoon stood, putting the desk between them like a barrier. Both. Gina studied him with those watchful eyes, seeing too much. I don't understand your world. The violence, the power games, the constant calculation, but I understand what I see in you when you hold those boys. You're trying to be better than what made you. I'm trying not to get them killed. By starting a war? By ending one. He gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white. Chairman Che killed their mother to use them as leverage against me. If I don't eliminate him completely, he'll come for them again. And next time, I might not be fast enough. Fear flickered across Gina's face, quickly suppressed. And what happens to June and Seo if you don't survive this war? The question hit harder than it should have. Jae-yoon had considered his own death a dozen times in the planning, had made provisions, had ensured Han would protect the boys if the worst happened. But hearing Gina voice it made the possibility feel catastrophically real. "They'll be protected," he said. "I've made arrangements." "That's not what I asked." She closed the distance between them, stopping close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender and something uniquely her. "Those boys just lost their mother. If they lose you too, they won't. You can't promise that." "I can promise I'll burn everything to ash before I let Che touch them." His voice dropped, lethal and certain, "including myself." Gina held his gaze, unflinching. "Then make sure you survive. Because they need you, not your protection, not your money. You." The intensity between them shifted, charged with something neither of them acknowledged. Jae-yoon was acutely aware of how close she stood, of the steadiness in her eyes, of the way her presence pulled at something he'd thought he'd killed years ago. "Why do you care?" he asked quietly. "Because someone has to." She reached out, her fingers brushing his where they gripped the desk. The contact was brief, innocent, but it burned. "And because I'm starting to believe you might actually be worth saving." She left before he could respond. Jae-yoon stood alone in the silent office, her words echoing. He picked up his phone, dialed Han. "Prepare for the complete dismantling of the Che syndicate," he said. "Full strike. No survivors." "Understood. Timeline? 48 hours. Jae-yoon looked at the encrypted drive, at Anita's final gift. "The Daunt will be lost tonight, so the father can survive tomorrow." He ended the call and walked toward the sound of his son's laughter, carrying the weight of what he was about to become. Jae-yoon left the safe house at noon, making sure every camera caught his departure. The convoy was excessive, 3 armored vehicles, 8 security personnel, Han at his side. He wore the tailored suit of the Daunt, his expression carved from ice as they drove toward Seoul's city center where the tower waited. The meeting was fabricated. A lure. Chairman Che's surveillance would report the Daunt exposed, vulnerable, miles away from the mountain safe house where his son slept. "He'll take the bait," Han said quietly from the passenger seat. "Intelligence confirms his retrieval team has been on standby for 72 hours. How long until they move?" 2 hours. Maybe less. Han's jaw tightened. "You're sure about this?" Jae-yoon stared through tinted windows at the city he'd conquered. "I need him to show his hand. All of it. Every resource, every operative. When he commits to taking my sons, I'll know exactly who to kill. And if we're not fast enough, we will be." The certainty in Jae-yoon's voice was absolute, but beneath it lurked something feral. If Che's men touched his children, there wouldn't be enough of Seoul left standing to bury the bodies. The tower rose ahead, glass and steel reflecting the afternoon sun. Jae-yoon's phone buzzed. A coded message from the safe house security. "All clear, subject secure." He memorized the timestamp. The clock was running. Gina felt it the moment the atmosphere shifted. She'd been reading to the twins in the living room, their small bodies pressed against her sides, when the hair on the back of her neck stood up. A primal warning that had nothing to do with sound, and everything to do with survival instinct. She glanced at the security monitors mounted discreetly in the corner. The external feeds showed nothing unusual. The mountain landscape was still, beautiful, empty. Too empty. Where were the patrol guards? Where was the secondary team that usually circled the perimeter every 20 minutes? Her phone buzzed. A message from Han. "Protocol Theta. Now." Her blood went cold. Protocol Theta meant imminent breach. It meant she had minutes, maybe less, to get the boys to safety. "June, CO," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "We're going to play a game." June looked up, his dark eyes too knowing. "Is someone coming?" The question broke her heart. 2 years old and already conditioned to fear strangers, to understand danger. "Yes, sweetheart, but I'm going to keep you safe." She gathered them quickly, moving toward the hidden door in the back hallway that led to the fortified panic room. Her hands trembled as she punched in the code Jae-yoon had made her memorize. The steel door slid open with a whisper, revealing a space designed to withstand siege-reinforced walls, independent air supply, communication equipment, and enough supplies for a week. She ushered the boys inside, their small faces pale with confusion and fear. Seo started crying softly, and Gina pulled them both against her, crouching to their level. "Listen to me," she said, her voice fierce. "Your father is coming. He will always come for you. But right now, you need to be very, very quiet. Can you do that?" They nodded, June's small hand gripping hers with surprising strength. Gina activated the panic room's locks, sealing them inside. Then she pulled up the security feeds on the internal monitor and watched her worst fears materialize. Dark figures moved through the tree line with military precision. 8 operatives dressed in tactical gear, weapons raised, spreading out to surround the house. They moved like shadows, professional and lethal. The external power died. The safe house plunged into darkness, backup generators kicking in a heartbeat later. But the message was clear. They were coming inside. Gina gathered the twins closer, her heart hammering, and prayed that Jae-yoon was already on his way. The alert hit Jae-yoon's phone 30 seconds after the power cut. Han saw his expression change and was already redirecting the convoy before the order was given. Go. Now. The armored vehicle peeled away from the tower, sirens screaming, Han barking commands into his comm unit. Backup teams mobilized from 3 locations, all converging on the mountain safe house with lethal intent. But Jae-yoon knew with sickening certainty that they wouldn't arrive in time. He called Gina. She answered on the first ring, her voice carefully controlled. We're in the panic room. They're inside the house. Don't open that door for anyone but me. His voice was lethal calm. I'm 10 minutes out. Jae-yoon. Her voice cracked slightly. They brought explosives. I can see them setting charges on the interior doors. 10 minutes might as well be a lifetime. The city blurred past at speeds that bent legality and physics. Jae-yoon gripped the door handle, his other hand white-knuckled around his phone. Every second stretched into eternity. Every breath felt like drowning. His sons, his June and Seo, hidden in darkness with a woman who'd promised to protect them, facing men who'd killed their mother without hesitation. The possession that roared through him was beyond rage. It was primal, absolute, a force that rewrote every calculation and priority. If they touched his children, if they so much as frightened them, there would be no mercy. No negotiation. Only blood and ash until every person who'd enabled this attack ceased to exist. Faster, he growled. Han pushed the vehicle beyond its limits. The mountain road appeared ahead, and Jae-yoon could see the safe house in the distance, dark, silent, violated. They arrived just as the first explosion lit up the interior. The front door blew inward with controlled precision, smoke and debris filling the entrance. Che's retrieval team was inside, moving toward the panic room with the confidence of men who believed the Daunt was miles away. They were wrong. Jae-yoon was already out of the vehicle before it fully stopped, weapon drawn, Han and the team flanking him. The safe house was supposed to be impenetrable, but Chairman Che had planned this for months. And now the predators were inside, hunting his sons in the darkness. Jae-yoon's last coherent thought before the violence started was a promise. I'm coming. Hold on. Then he stepped into the shadows and became the monster his enemies should have feared from the beginning. The darkness inside the safe house was absolute. Smoke from the breached entrance curling through corridors like living shadow. Jae-yoon moved through it with predatory silence, weapon raised, every sense sharpened to lethal focus. His breathing was controlled, his footsteps soundless against marble floors he'd walked 100 times. He knew this house. Every corner, every blind spot, every place where shadows could hide a killer. And right now, he was the worst thing hiding in them. The first operative never saw him coming. Jae-yoon materialized from the darkness behind him, one hand covering his mouth, the other driving a blade between ribs with surgical precision. The man went down without sound, and Jae-yoon was already moving, leaving the body cooling in the hallway. 2 more operatives ahead, sweeping the eastern corridor. They communicated through hand signals, professional and disciplined. Jae-yoon waited until they separated, one checking the office, one moving toward the kitchen, then struck. The violence was efficient, brutal, silent. He didn't fight for dominance or control. He fought to end, to remove threats with the cold certainty of a father protecting his young. Each movement was deliberate, fueled by the image of June and Seo huddled in darkness, terrified and waiting for him to make good on his promise. 3 down, 5 remaining. Voices crackled through their comms. Korean clipped, urgent. They'd realized the Daunt wasn't miles away, that they'd walked into a trap of their own making. Too late. Jae-yoon found the next 2 near the central staircase, both heavily armed, both scanning the darkness with night vision gear. He killed the lights on the backup generator with a switch near the security panel, plunging the house into deeper blackness. Their night vision became a liability, the sudden absence of light blinding them. He moved like vengeance personified. Close quarters combat that was more execution than fight. One went down with a crushed windpipe. The other managed to get a shot off the muzzle flash, lighting up the hallway for a split second before Jae-yoon disarmed him and ended it. The gunshot would alert the others. Fine. Let them know death was coming. He found the remaining 3 at the panic room entrance. One was setting charges on the reinforced door, while 2 provided cover, weapons trained on the corridor. They'd heard the gunshot, knew they were compromised, and were racing to complete the extraction before reinforcements arrived. The lead operative was massive, scarred, the kind of mercenary who'd survived 100 operations and believed himself untouchable. He barked orders in Mandarin, and the man setting charges worked faster, sweat dripping despite the cold. Jae-yoon stepped into the corridor. No more stealth, no more silence. "You're in my house," he said, his voice carrying through the darkness like a death sentence. All 3 spun, weapons raised. The lead operative's eyes widened, fractionally recognition, calculation, fear. "The Daunt," he said, and there was grudging respect in his tone. "We were told you'd be in the city. You were misinformed." The firefight was brief and vicious. Jae-yoon used the corridor's narrow space to his advantage, forcing them into close quarters where their numbers meant nothing. He moved with the terrifying efficiency of a man who'd learned violence from his father's enforcers and perfected it through years of survival. The first operative went down quickly. The second managed to clip Jae-yoon's shoulder pain, exploding white-hot through his arm before Jae-yoon's return fire dropped him permanently. Then it was just Jae-yoon and the lead mercenary. They circled each other in the smoky corridor, both breathing hard, both bleeding. The man was skilled, experienced, dangerous, but Jae-yoon was fighting for something beyond survival. He was fighting for the terrified children on the other side of that steel door, for the woman who'd shielded them with her own body, for the chance to be the father Anita had trusted him to become. The mercenary lunged. Jae-yoon met him with feral intensity, the fight devolving into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Fists, elbows, a viciousness born of desperation and rage. The mercenary was stronger, but Jae-yoon was faster, more willing to sacrifice his own body to land the killing blow. They crashed into the wall near the panic room door. Jae-yoon felt ribs crack his or the mercenaries'. He couldn't tell. Pain was irrelevant. Only victory mattered. He got his hands around the man's throat and squeezed until bone fractured and breathing stopped. The body went limp, sliding down the wall to join the others. Jae-yoon stood alone in the corridor, bloodied and heaving, surrounded by the evidence of what he'd become. His shoulder screamed pain where the bullet had grazed him. His knuckles were split. Blood, his and theirs, soaked his shirt. But his sons were safe. He punched in the override code with shaking hands. The panic room door slid open, revealing Gina crouched in the corner with Jun and Seo pressed against her. She held a decorative lamp like a weapon, her dark eyes fierce despite the terror written across her face. When she saw him bloodied, dangerous, barely human, relief and fear warred in her expression. Jae-yoon. He didn't let her finish. He crossed the space in 2 strides, gathering his sons into his arms with desperate strength. They clung to him immediately, small bodies shaking, and Jae-yoon pressed his face into their hair, breathing them in, confirming they were whole and alive, and his, "I'm here," he whispered raggedly. "I'm here. You're safe." Jun's small hand found the blood on Jae-yoon's shoulder, and the boy's eyes went wide. "You're hurt." "It's nothing. A lie, but necessary. Are you both okay? Did anyone touch you?" They shook their heads, still crying but unharmed. Jae-yoon looked up at Gina, who stood watching with tears streaming down her brown cheeks. She'd kept them safe, had been willing to fight with a lamp against armed operatives to protect children who weren't even hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "You saved them." She nodded, unable to speak. The sound of boots thundered through the house, Han and reinforcements finally arriving, securing the perimeter and clearing the dead. Han appeared in the doorway, took in the scene, and his expression shifted to something almost like pride. "It's over," Han said quietly. "They're all dead or captured. Chairman Che's assault team is finished." Jae-yoon held his sons tighter, felt Gina's hand rest gently on his uninjured shoulder, and allowed himself one moment of relief before the next war began, because this had only been the opening move, and now Chairman Che would learn exactly what happened when you threatened the Daunt's children. Jae-yoon didn't wait for his shoulder to heal before he destroyed Chairman Che. 72 hours after the safe house assault, while doctors were still stitching his wounds and his sons still woke screaming, he sat in the temporary command center and unleashed hell. Anita's ledger went live at midnight. Every journalist, every prosecutor, every international agency that had been chasing Che's ghost for years received the complete files simultaneously. 3 years of meticulously documented crimes, trafficking routes, laundered billions, blackmail evidence, the names of politicians and judges in his pocket, all of it exposed in a single devastating data dump. By dawn, Che's legitimate empire was in freefall. Banks froze accounts, partners severed ties, governments issued warrants. But Jae-yoon wasn't satisfied with legal destruction. The Kang syndicate moved like a scalpel, precise and merciless. Che's operations in Busan were dismantled before sunrise. His Shanghai connections were severed by noon, his Tokyo safe houses burned by evening. Every asset, every operative, every thread of power that Chairman Che had spent decades building was systematically erased. Han coordinated the strikes with cold efficiency, but it was Jae-yoon's fury that drove them. The man who'd killed Anita, who'd sent armed mercenaries after 2-year-olds, who'd believed the Daunt's love for his children was a weakness to exploit that man would cease to exist. Chairman Che was found in a Hong Kong hotel room 72 hours later, dead from a single gunshot wound. The official report called it suicide. Everyone in the underworld knew better. The message was clear. Touch the Daunt's children, and not even death would be quick. 2 weeks after Che's elimination, Jae-yoon called a meeting of the Council of Elders. He arrived at the private estate outside Seoul where they gathered, his sons conspicuously absent, his expression carved from granite. "I'm stepping down," he said without preamble. Effective immediately. Han will assume control of all legitimate Kang operations. The rest, the shadow business, the enforcement, the things my father built dissolves. Anyone who objects can take it up with me personally. Silence. The council members exchanged looks but said nothing. They'd seen what happened to Chairman Che. They'd watched the Daunt dismantle a rival syndicate in less than a week. No one was foolish enough to challenge him. "The Kang name remains," Jae-yoon continued, his voice lethal calm. "But the Daunt dies today. My sons will inherit wealth, not blood debts. They'll grow up knowing their father, not fearing him." He left without waiting for their blessing. He didn't need it. 3 months later, the coastal town of Yeosu felt like another world. The small house Jae-yoon had purchased sat on a cliff overlooking the sea, far from Seoul's shadows and the weight of the empire he'd abandoned. The air smelled of salt and freedom. Jae-yoon stood on the wooden deck, watching Jun and Seo chase each other through the grass. They laughed real, unguarded laughter that still startled him with its purity. Seo stumbled, and Jun immediately helped him up, their bond deeper than anything violence or power could forge. They were healing, slowly, but unmistakably. Gina knelt in the garden she'd planted, her hands working rich soil around tomato plants. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a linen shirt, and her natural hair was pulled back with a colorful scarf. The morning sun painted her brown skin gold, and when she looked up and caught him staring, her smile was knowing and warm. "You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "Staring like you're trying to memorize me." He didn't deny it. Over the past 3 months, Gina had become essential not as the governess anymore, but as the steady presence that anchored all of them. She'd stayed when she had every reason to leave, had chosen this quiet life with a former crime lord and his traumatized sons. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands, and crossed to where he stood. The boys' laughter filled the space between them, a sound that 3 months ago would have seemed impossible. "How's your shoulder?" she asked, her fingers brushing the place where the bullet had grazed him. "Healed." The touch sent heat through him that had nothing to do with injury, and everything to do with the way she looked at him like he was worth saving. And the nightmares? Less frequent. He'd wake sometimes, heart racing, convinced Che's men had breached the house, but then he'd hear Gina's breathing from the guest room down the hall, his sons sleeping peacefully, and the panic would recede. "Good." She studied his face with those watchful dark eyes. "You look different here. Lighter. I feel different." He caught her hand before she could pull away, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I'm not the Daunt anymore. I'm just a father. A man. Someone who's learning that power and control aren't the same as safety and love." She stepped closer, and the air between them charged with something they'd both been carefully ignoring. "I see you, Jae-yoon. The real you. And I'm not afraid." The words unlocked something he'd been guarding. He lifted his free hand, cupped her face, felt her breath catch. The magnetic pull between them had been building for months, through shared nightmares and morning routines, through the quiet intimacy of raising children together, through the trust that came from surviving darkness side by side. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "Probably not." Her smile was gentle, devastating. "But maybe that's not the point anymore." Jun's voice cut through the moment. "Gina, come see." She laughed, the sound bright, and pulled away to join the boys. But she looked back at him, and the promise in her eyes was clear. Later, when the children slept and the house quieted, when they could explore this thing growing between them without audience or hesitation, Jae-yoon watched his sons show Gina a shell they'd found, watched her kneel to their level and make them feel heard, watched the woman who'd saved his children's lives now save his soul piece by careful piece. The Daunt was dead, but the father, the man, was learning to live, and for the first time in his violent, blood-soaked life, Jae-yoon believed in redemption. That's how you rewrite a legacy, family. The ruthless Daunt traded his empire for something no amount of power could buy: the chance to be loved not for what he controls, but for who he's becoming. If this story grabbed you by the throat and refused to let go, hit that like button, subscribe for more dark romance that'll ruin you for anything vanilla, and drop a comment telling me whose story you want next. Because in this world, everyone's got blood on their hands and love in their hearts. The question is, which one wins?